The Bigfoot, more than 8 feet tall, stood between me and the hiker's body, its shoulders almost as wide as the cedar trunk behind it. I had drawn my gun, but my fingers stayed outside the trigger guard. Behind me, Evan was breathing hard and raising his carbine. The Bigfoot stared straight at us, then slammed one huge hand against the tree beside it. It could have charged. It did not. It only spread both arms, blocking the trail completely. That was when I understood it was not trying to kill us. Hello everyone, I'm Victor, and today we're heading into a strange story that took place deep in the North Cascades of Washington State. This account was compiled by our editorial team from several stories, forums, blogs, and reports about mysterious encounters in deep forests. We cannot fully verify whether this is true, an exaggerated memory, or a modern legend passed from person to person. So listen with an open mind and draw your own conclusion. If you believe American forests still hide something, comment, Bigfoot. Now, this is the story of Deputy Sheriff Brian Mercer. Brian Mercer, a veteran deputy sheriff with Skagit County, was assigned to lead 2 forensic staff members into the North Cascades to recover the body of a missing hiker. What should have been a familiar job quickly became a tense confrontation when a giant creature covered in gray-brown fur appeared and deliberately stopped Brian's team from reaching the scene. Instead of attacking, the creature only warned them to stop. When Brian decided to pull back and observe, he discovered the Bigfoot and 2 smaller individuals were protecting the body from scavengers. Realizing the creature had awareness and clear purpose, Brian lowered his weapon, stepped out alone, and asked permission to bring the dead man home to his family. The encounter changed Brian's entire view of the beings in the forest. But the real danger appeared afterward, when a secret federal group seized evidence, planted cameras, and set traps to hunt the Bigfoot. Brian had to choose between duty to the government and his moral responsibility to creatures that had shown more compassion than many humans he had met. In late October of 2018, just after the clock on the wall of the Skagit County Sheriff's Office passed 4:40 in the morning, Brian Mercer was still sitting at his desk, reviewing a report about an accident on State Route 20. Nearly 30 years in law enforcement had made him used to mornings that began with cold coffee, fluorescent lights, and bad news from places normal people rarely entered. Sheriff Daniel Cole stepped out of his office, placed a file in front of Brian, and said a hiker named Caleb Rourke, 34 years old, had lost signal east of Baker Lake. Caleb's emergency locator had last transmitted near a deep rock chute where a rescue helicopter had seen a patch of orange jacket through fog and thick fur canopy. No movement had been recorded, and mountain winds had kept the pilot from descending. Daniel explained that a cold storm was moving into the North Cascades and could cover the area in snow within 36 hours. Brian opened the topographic map, measured the distance from the last vehicle access point to the signal location, then asked how far the first search team had made it. Daniel stayed quiet for a moment before answering that they had turned back early, after hearing several tree knocks around the area. The report called it trees falling in the wind, but one member had written by hand that the team withdrew before dark. Brian did not comment. He checked camera batteries, radio, recovery ropes, the body bag, and the scene-marking kit with the careful routine of long habit. Before standing, he opened the family photo Caleb's file included. In the picture, Caleb had one arm around his wife, while a little girl stood in front, smiling with 2 missing front teeth. Brian folded the photo, placed it in his jacket pocket, and told Daniel he would bring that man home before the storm arrived. When Brian stepped into the parking lot, he saw a red circle on the search team's paper map around the rock chute. Beside it was a rushed, slanted note, "Do not continue after dusk." It was still dark when the Skagit County utility vehicle left the main road and headed toward Baker Lake. Brian Mercer drove, his eyes moving between the narrow road ahead and the folded map beside the gear shift. In the passenger seat, Marissa Chen checked each forensic equipment box. In the back, Evan Doyle held his carbine across his chest, as if its weight helped steady him. Evan had not been in Skagit County long after transferring from Tacoma. He was technically skilled, but not used to trips deep into the mountains. He tried joking that, if they met Sasquatch, Brian should let him take a picture before writing the report. Brian only answered that the things that usually killed people in the woods were weather, terrain, and too much confidence. When the vehicle stopped before a large fir lying across the road, all three had to get out and carry the gear on foot. Brian approached the broken trunk and studied the bright wood surface. The tree had not been uprooted. There were no lightning burns. It had been snapped across at nearly 7 feet high, a detail that made him stand still several seconds longer before marking the location in his notebook. After almost an hour along an abandoned trail, they found the first search team's boot prints. The overlapping, stretched, disordered steps showed that the group had come back in a hurry. Evan asked why the report did not mention that they hadn't run. Brian said official reports often contained only what the writer was willing to admit. At a dry creek bed, Marissa found a branch placed across the path at chest height. Both ends had been cleanly broken, and 3 clumps of moss hung from it at almost even spacing. Brian removed it and led the group forward. A deep knock sounded from the mountainside. 3 seconds later, a second knock answered from the opposite slope. Evan immediately pulled the carbine from its sling, but Brian told him to lower it because there was no target in front of them. When all three looked back at the trail behind them, Marissa froze. The branch Brian had removed was now standing exactly where it had been, balanced between 2 trees, even though no footsteps had sounded behind them. All three went silent as the fog began closing over the path home. Brian returned to the branch and used his flashlight to inspect the damp soil around the 2 fir trunks, but he found no boot prints and no disturbed leaves. He marked the bark with white chalk to make sure they had not somehow circled back in the thickening fog. As they continued, the GPS unit in Marissa's hand began fluctuating strangely, the distance numbers shifting even though all three were standing still. Brian put the device away, opened the topographic map, and used a compass to confirm direction. Near a small stream, Evan stopped suddenly and pointed to the mud beside the water. A bare footprint was pressed clearly into the soft earth, nearly 18 inches long, with 5 separated toes and a heel wider than any adult human foot. Evan crouched and said someone had used a mold for a joke, but Marissa immediately pointed to the mud, pushed to both sides and the crease across the sole. Those details showed weight had shifted from heel to toes in a real step. Brian placed his own boot beside the print to photograph it, then saw the second print more than 5 feet away. The track line went straight up a root-covered slope where any normal person would need hands to climb. Evan wanted to follow, believing whoever made the prints was still close. Brian reminded him their job was to find Caleb, not chase something they did not understand. They continued toward the final coordinates, and only a few minutes later, the ravens that had been circling overhead suddenly vanished. Marissa stopped and quietly said she could no longer hear insects either. Brian lifted a hand, signaling everyone to stay still. For about 10 seconds, the forest became so motionless that he could hear Evan's quick breathing. A sharp odor moved through the trees, like wet animal fur mixed with rotting earth. Evan turned and raised the carbine toward the brush. Brian ordered him to keep the muzzle down. At that moment, a small stone flew out of the darkness and landed in front of Brian's boot. A second stone came from the opposite direction and struck the path behind them. Brian stepped over, turned it with his hand, and found a plastic name tag underneath. The tag belonged to Jason Miller, the search team member who had written the warning on the map. Brian placed Jason Miller's name tag in an evidence pouch and led the group toward Caleb's last coordinates. The fog sank lower, coating the fir trunks in a thin white layer that made distance difficult to judge. Less than 20 minutes later, Marissa found a dark blue backpack propped against the base of a tree. Brian recognized Caleb Rourke's name, written on the shoulder strap. The position caught his attention, because the backpack was far from the slide path, down into the rock chute, and had been placed upright, as if someone had carried it there on purpose. The main zipper was open. Wallet, food, flashlight, and locator device were still inside. The first aid kit had been removed and placed on a flat stone. A roll of gauze had been torn from its packaging, but the surface was clean and had not been wrapped around any wound. Marissa knelt to examine it, then said someone had searched for first aid supplies in a hurry, but with purpose. Brian saw a small dried blood stain on the strap, too little to explain a serious injury. He unlocked Caleb's phone with the emergency code provided by the family and found the last video, 19 seconds long. The footage shook violently and showed only dark forest floor, stones falling from the slope, and Caleb breathing hard. In the wind, the man said something below was trying to push him away from the edge. A deep sound rose after the sentence. Then the screen went black. Evan immediately said they had just heard proof of an attack, but Brian told him not to turn a panic statement into a conclusion. Marissa pointed to the intact backpack and reminded them there were no claw marks, bite marks, or signs of struggle around it. On the nearest tree, Brian found 3 large muddy marks more than 8 feet high, shaped like giant fingers braced against the bark. The GPS showed they were only about 140 meters from the body. When Brian lifted the backpack, a deep breath sounded behind the trees, so close that wet leaves trembled under their feet. Brian raised his hand to signal Marissa and Evan to stay close, while his eyes remained fixed on the darkness between the fir trunks. A branch ahead shook, and a huge dark figure slipped through a narrow gap as if the forest had opened for it. The creature stepped onto the trail, more than 8 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with arms nearly reaching its knees and gray-brown fur damp from fog. Brian knew at once this was not a bear standing on its hind legs. The way it balanced, placed its feet, and shifted weight looked natural, like a being that had walked upright its whole life. Its face showed beneath thick fur, low forehead, wide nose, dark gray skin, and deep eyes watching each person with caution. Brian drew his handgun, but kept the barrel pointed at the ground. Marissa stood frozen, clutching her camera to her chest. Evan pulled the carbine to his shoulder and flicked off the safety. Brian ordered him to lower the weapon. Evan said the creature in front of them might have killed Caleb, but Brian did not take his eyes off it. The Bigfoot stood exactly between the humans and the rock chute, where a patch of orange jacket could be seen through branches. Brian stepped left. The creature shifted with him, blocking the way. He moved right. It blocked him again with such accuracy that it was hard to call instinct. Brian spoke loudly, saying they had come to bring Caleb home to his family and did not want to harm anyone. The creature tilted its head, eyes still locked on his face. Evan moved half a step forward, muzzle level with the creature's chest. The Bigfoot turned, swung one hand into the tree beside it, and tore bark away in an explosion of splinters and wet wood. The impact ran through the ground into the souls of all 3 people. Evan jerked his shoulder and put his finger on the trigger. Brian lunged sideways and pushed the carbine barrel down just as Evan's hand tightened. A deep sound rolled from the creature's chest, vibrating hard through Brian's ribs. Even then, the Bigfoot did not move forward. It had enough strength to close the distance between them in a few steps, but it chose to hold its position in front of the rock chute. Brian looked past its shoulder and saw Caleb's body below the wall, surrounded by several fresh, large footprints. Farther back in the forest, a branch moved against the wind. He understood they were facing more than one individual. Brian ordered the group to back away one step at a time, keeping hands away from triggers. The Bigfoot watched until they had withdrawn far enough, then lowered its arms. When Marissa raised the camera for one last look, she went still. Behind the adult creature, two smaller faces were silently watching them from the dark. Brian led Marissa and Evan away from the forest corridor, moving along the slope until they found high ground where they could observe the chute while keeping a retreat route. Evan spun around, his voice tense with anger. He said Brian had let an animal push the whole team back, while Caleb's body still lay only a few hundred feet away. Evan wanted to call a tactical team, a helicopter, and more rifles before the thing disappeared. Marissa removed the camera from her neck, opened the frames she had taken, and said what they needed was to understand what was blocking them, not turn the forest into a hunt. Brian checked his watch. They had about 6 hours of daylight, but clouds were building low and the temperature was dropping. He turned to Evan and asked him to describe the Bigfoot's behavior clearly. Evan said it had threatened them. Brian asked how many steps the creature had taken toward them. Evan went silent because it had only moved to block the path. Marissa zoomed in on a photo and showed both men the screen. Behind the adult were two smaller faces, one nearly 6 feet tall, the other shorter. Brian understood this might be a family group, and the largest individual was protecting both the body and the members behind it. Evan still believed they should radio it in. Brian objected, because an uncontrolled report could bring dozens of armed people into the mountains before anyone understood what was happening. The radio signal came and went, but they were able to report that the team had not reached the body because of activity from a large animal. Daniel asked Brian to assess whether they should withdraw before the weather worsened. Brian answered that they would observe a little longer before deciding. Evan accused him of risking lives out of curiosity. Brian looked directly at him and said he was trying not to trade the living for the dead and not to turn a warning into a massacre. Marissa agreed to set up an observation point. Evan reluctantly sat down, keeping the carbine close. At that moment, a wolf howl rose from the direction of the body. It was followed by a deep roar and the sound of several animals fleeing through the forest. Brian chose a high ledge angled north of the chute, where they could observe the scene through a gap between fir trunks while still keeping an exit route. Marissa knelt behind a moss-covered rock, attached a telephoto lens to her camera, and activated a handheld thermal camera. Evan sat a few feet lower, the carbine across his lap, while Brian watched the adult creature near Caleb's body through binoculars. After a few minutes, the two smaller individuals emerged from deeper forest. The taller one carried a bundle of broken branches. The smallest held several cedar limbs with both hands. They approached slowly and placed the branches around the hiker's body, as if building a protective cover. Brian watched closely and noticed they avoided touching Caleb roughly. A long howl sounded from the north. 3 gray wolves stepped from the brush, heads low, sniffing as they moved down the slope toward the body. The adult Bigfoot immediately stepped in front of them. It widened its shoulders and released a deep sound that stopped the wolves, but the lead wolf still moved several steps closer. The creature bent, picked up a heavy branch, and threw it hard into the ground in front of the wolf's muzzle. Dirt exploded upward, forcing the pack to turn and run into the trees. The smallest individual moved closer to Caleb's orange jacket and reached toward his chest. The adult Bigfoot gently took its wrist and pulled it back, like an adult stopping a child from touching something that needed respect. Marissa kept taking photos, her breathing slowly easing as she understood the creatures were not treating the body as food. Evan whispered that they might be saving it for later. Brian pointed to the stones the mid-sized individual was arranging around the edge of the chute. The placement would keep Caleb's body from sliding deeper if the soil softened in the rain. Brian remembered the first aid kit removed from the backpack and began to imagine another possibility. Maybe these creatures had tried to help Caleb after the fall. The light in the forest shifted into cold gray. Suddenly, the adult Bigfoot lifted its head and looked directly at the place where the three humans were hiding. It had known they were there from the beginning. The creature placed one hand on its chest, then turned its palm toward the body, a gesture that made Brian feel it was taking responsibility for guarding Caleb. Marissa lowered the thermal camera and checked the screen again. Besides the 3 heat signatures near the chute, she saw 2 more large figures moving deeper in the forest, showing that the family in front of them might only be a small part of a larger community. The radio beside Brian's knee suddenly released a broken stream of sound, sometimes clear, sometimes buried under wind through the canopy. He lifted it, turned toward an open gap, and called Daniel 3 times before receiving an answer. The sheriff's voice distorted through weak signal, but the message was clear enough. Caleb's family was waiting for an update. If the body was not recovered that day, a larger rescue team would enter the forest the next morning. Brian asked who would be on the new team. Daniel said they would bring search dogs, climbing equipment, bear defense weapons, and a helicopter if weather allowed. That information made Brian tighten his grip on the radio. He understood that barking, unfamiliar scent, and dozens of armed people could turn a confrontation still held at the level of warning into disaster. Brian reported that several large unidentified animals were preventing access. Daniel assumed he meant bears, and Brian did not correct him because another unit could be listening on the same frequency. Evan stood beside him and demanded that Brian say exactly what they had seen so command could send enough firepower. Marissa objected, saying any report mentioning Bigfoot would draw more curious people than rescuers. Brian looked at his watch, then at the patch of orange jacket visible below the rock chute. He decided they had to find a way to bring Caleb out before dawn. Evan grew angry, saying the temperature was falling and staying would only trap all 3 of them. Brian answered that leaving now meant dogs, guns, and helicopters would flood the area in the morning. Evan asked why he cared more about those creatures than a dead man. Brian took Caleb's family photo from his jacket pocket, looked at the little girl standing in front of her father, and said he was trying to protect both sides. Cold rain began falling, forcing them to set a low tarp between the rocks. When Brian looked back toward the chute, the ground where Caleb's body had been was completely empty. Marissa immediately checked the series of photos she had just taken, comparing rocks and tree positions to make sure they had not mistaken the location. Caleb's body had been below the chute only minutes earlier, but now the spot held only disturbed cedar branches. Through the thermal camera, she saw 3 heat signatures moving down into the lower part of the chute. Evan said the creatures had carried the body away. Brian looked at the rainwater beginning to run harder down the slope and guessed they were moving Caleb out of the low ground before the water rose. He decided to move closer, while still keeping distance from the boundary the Bigfoot had established. All 3 turned off white lights, switched to red light, and edged down the wet slope. Rain clung to their collars, making every step heavy, while the darkness between the trunks made the distance ahead seem longer than it was. The sound of dragged branches and stones striking one another came from ahead. Behind a fallen tree, Brian saw the adult creature lifting Caleb's shoulders, while the mid-sized one held his legs. They worked together slowly, placing the man's body onto a patch of higher ground, nearly 10 meters above the water. Caleb was lifted from the earth with such care that Marissa almost forgot to keep filming. The smallest individual walked close beside them, bent to pick up the glove that had slipped from the dead man's hand, and placed it back on his chest. Evan gradually lowered the carbine, the certainty in his eyes no longer there. At that moment, a dry branch snapped beneath his boot. The adult Bigfoot whipped around, set Caleb down, and took one heavy step toward them. Brian lifted both hands, signaling everyone to back away. The creature bent and picked up a large stone, holding it at chest height but not throwing it. When the three humans withdrew from the clearing, it set the stone down and returned to the body. Brian understood that the creature had restrained its reaction even after being startled. Back at the observation point, he told Evan, the Bigfoot had not stolen Caleb. It had just saved his body from rising water. Marissa slowed the footage and zoomed in on the adult's shoulder. Deep in the gray-brown fur was a small metal object, and the surrounding skin was swollen red, like an old wound that had never healed. That detail made Brian understand the creature had been carrying that injury before they arrived. Marissa enlarged the frame until the metal object in the creature's shoulder became clearer. It looked like the broken head of a hunting arrow, the rest buried beneath fur, matted with dried blood. The surrounding skin was swollen, and each time the Bigfoot rotated its shoulder, the movement looked stiff and slow. Brian stared at the wound for a long moment. This creature had been hurt by humans, yet it still chose warning instead of attack. Evan said a wounded animal was even less predictable, and that they should keep distance. Brian opened the first aid kit, took out water, gauze, and antiseptic, then walked down to the edge of the open ground. He placed everything where the Bigfoot had stood, blocking their path, then backed away to the observation point with his hands held in front of his chest. Evan shook his head, saying the creature would not know what any of those things were for. Brian reminded him of Caleb's opened first aid kit and the gauze that had been removed from its packaging. Almost 20 minutes passed with rain striking the tarp. The mid-sized individual stepped out from the forest, moving carefully toward the items Brian had left. It sniffed the water bottle, touched the antiseptic, then picked up the gauze roll between two large fingers before returning to the adult. The Bigfoot took the gauze, looked toward Brian, and released a short, low sound very different from its warnings earlier. A few minutes later, the mid-sized individual wrapped the bandage around the wounded shoulder in clumsy but intentional loops. Brian placed a hand on his chest, keeping the gesture slow so the creature would understand he was not demanding anything in return. The adult Bigfoot watched him, then briefly placed its own hand on its chest. Marissa noticed that it had shifted slightly away from the path it had been blocking, though its eyes remained on Caleb's body. Evan asked Brian whether he truly believed the creatures understood kindness. Brian answered that he did not know what name they gave the act, but it was clear they understood the meaning of a person setting down a weapon and leaving help behind. As darkness covered the chute, the adult Bigfoot suddenly turned its head north. A bear roared somewhere in the forest, followed by heavy footsteps moving straight toward their observation point. The bear roared again, closer and deeper, making Evan immediately tighten his grip on the carbine. Brian pulled the tarp down, told Marissa to back against the rock wall, and looked toward the brush, shaking violently in the rain. An adult black bear stepped out of the dark, its fur soaked and its shoulder nearly level with Brian's chest. Wind blew from the observation point toward the bear, carrying the smell of food and people. The animal stopped, lifted its head to sniff, then stood on its hind legs. Marissa took a step back. Her heel slipped in mud and hit the rock behind her. Evan raised the carbine to his shoulder. Brian told him to wait, because the bear was still assessing the situation, and one gunshot could make every creature around the chute react at once. For that moment, Brian still believed they had time to slowly back toward the larger trees. But when the bear dropped down and moved a few steps closer, Evan panicked and fired a warning shot into the canopy. The gunshot rolled through the valley, tearing apart the silence Brian had worked for hours to preserve. The bear startled, turned its head for one beat, then suddenly charged up the slope toward them. Brian had just drawn his handgun when the adult Bigfoot appeared from the left and stepped straight into the space between the bear and the three humans. The creature slammed both hands against the ground and released a sound so deep that rainwater trembled on the leaves. The bear changed direction and faced it. The Bigfoot bent down, lifted a heavy branch, and threw it hard into the ground in front of the bear. Dirt and stone burst upward, and the bear backed away, roaring for several seconds before turning and running downhill into the forest. The Bigfoot chased only a short distance, then immediately returned to stand in the same guarding position before the chute. Brian understood the creature had placed itself in danger to keep the bear away from both the body and the humans. Marissa watched the scene through her camera screen, hands shaking, but her eyes steady. She understood what they were witnessing went far beyond ordinary self-defense by a wild animal. The Bigfoot's gaze shifted to Evan and stopped on the smoking barrel. Evan's hands trembled, and he raised the carbine again. Brian stepped in, tore the weapon from him, and removed the magazine. The Bigfoot gave a heavy warning sound, then retreated into the dark. When its footsteps vanished, tree knocks began sounding from several directions. Each one came closer, as if Evan's gunshot had awakened the entire forest. The knocks broke into different rhythms, sounding from 4 directions, around the observation point and echoing across the mountain like a deliberate exchange. Brian immediately shut off the lights, pulled Marissa low behind a rock, and signaled Evan to stay quiet. The thermal camera showed flickering heat shapes between trees, appearing left, then sliding behind them, proving there were more creatures around them than they had seen. Evan reached toward the carbine, but Brian gripped the sling and refused to return it. Evan grew angry, saying Brian was letting emotion override duty. Brian looked straight at him and reminded him that fear had just made him fire without a target. And that shot had turned every attempt at trust into a threat. A small stone landed near the edge of the tarp. Seconds later, a large branch was placed across their retreat route, clear enough to show the creatures were controlling the path, but still leaving space. Brian removed the magazine from the carbine, placed the weapon on a rock in the open, then secured his handgun in its holster. Evan objected. Marissa said nothing, watching because she understood the choice was the only way to keep the situation from sliding further. Brian stepped out from cover, raised both hands, and said loudly that the gunshot had been a mistake. He did not know whether the creatures understood each word, but he believed they recognized voice, posture, and the fact that the humans had put down a weapon voluntarily. The forest kept knocking for nearly a minute. Then the sounds slowed and disappeared one by one, leaving only a single knock from the direction of the chute. Brian felt it was permission to approach, or a final boundary that had to be respected. At the edge of the dark, the smallest individual slowly stepped forward. It placed the gauze Brian had given them on the ground, then backed away. The white fabric now held dark bloodstains from the adult's shoulder, a simple answer that his help had been understood. Marissa looked at Brian and realized the fragile door of communication had opened again. Brian looked at the blood-stained gauze on the ground and understood this chance would not come twice. He removed his sheriff's hat, took off his outer jacket, and placed his badge on the rock beside the unloaded carbine. Marissa asked what he was doing. Evan immediately objected when he saw Brian stepping out of cover with both hands empty. Brian said he needed the creature to understand they were there for Caleb, not for territory or the beings living in the forest. He told Marissa to hold Evan back if he reached for a weapon, then slowly walked toward the open ground. The adult Bigfoot appeared between two furs, its wounded shoulder wrapped in clumsy loops of bandage. The distance between them was almost 30 meters, but Brian could still feel the weight in its eyes. He pointed to his own chest and said, "Brian." Then he took the photo of Caleb with his wife and child from his shirt pocket. Brian held it up, pointed to the man in the picture, pointed toward the body below the chute, and finally toward the way out of the forest. The creature watched every movement, its eyes shifting from Brian's face to the photograph. A deep sound in 2 separate beats left its chest. Brian did not understand the meaning, but the sound did not carry warning. He lowered to one knee, placed the photo on the ground, and pulled his hands away from it. The Bigfoot took 3 steps forward, making Evan rise behind him, but Marissa held his arm. The creature bent, picked up the picture between 2 large fingers, and stared for a long time at Caleb's little girl. That attention made Brian realize the creature understood the image represented a family waiting for him. The Bigfoot placed the photo back, turned its head, and gave a low call toward the forest. The 2 smaller individuals stepped out and stood behind its shoulder. The adult moved aside, opening the way to the chute while keeping its eyes on Brian. He understood he had been allowed to enter. He had not won the right. As Brian crossed the boundary, he saw a long slide mark running from the cliff edge to Caleb's body, along with deep furrows in the soil, like giant fingers had tried to hold someone sliding from the slope. Near the edge, a piece of black nail remained caught in the collapsed dirt beside a torn strip of jacket strap. Brian signaled for Marissa and Evan to approach after the adult moved aside, but he required both of them to leave weapons by the rock. Marissa brought the forensic bag and camera. Evan moved more slowly, his eyes shifting constantly between Caleb's body and the 3 creatures standing around the chute. The adult Bigfoot watched every movement, close enough to intervene if anything made it cautious. Marissa knelt beside Caleb and checked the body position, head, shoulders, and chest, before saying the injuries matched a fall from significant height. There were no bite marks, claw wounds, or injuries suggesting a struggle. Above the chute, freshly collapsed rock formed a long slide path, and Caleb's boot prints began right at the edge. Brian followed that line and found 2 human handprints pressed deep into mud, with several larger furrows running beside them. Those furrows ended at the torn shoulder strap from the backpack. Brian crouched and fit the clues together in his mind. Caleb must have slipped. A huge hand had grabbed the backpack strap and tried to pull him back. The pull had been strong enough to tear the fabric, but not fast enough to stop him from falling. Marissa checked Caleb's watch, body temperature, and tissue condition, then said he may have lived for a short time after the fall. Brian looked back toward the first aid kit that had been opened earlier. On one piece of gauze was Caleb's blood mixed with wide, muddy smears like huge fingerprints. The way the supplies had been removed showed someone had watched Caleb search for help, then tried to copy what he had done. The final video also meant something different now. When Caleb said the creature was trying to push him from the ledge, it may have been warning him away from ground about to collapse. The smallest individual approached, placed a cedar branch beside the body, and stepped back. Evan watched, both hands hanging low. He understood his gunshot had nearly taken the life of a creature that had tried to save Caleb. Brian photographed every trace, but avoided aiming the lens toward the path deeper into the forest. When he bent near Caleb's right hand, he found a clump of gray-brown fur and a small metal fragment like the arrowhead lodged in the Bigfoot's shoulder. That detail made him realize that before Caleb died, he may have tried to help the very creature now standing guard over him. The meeting had not been random at all. Brian gently opened Caleb's right hand, used tweezers to remove the clump of gray-brown fur caught between the fingers, and placed it in a sample bag. Beneath the fur, A dark dried smear of blood stained the dead man's fingertips, different in color from the blood around his own wounds. Marissa examined it and said Caleb had likely touched the creature's injured shoulder directly. When Brian checked the hiker's jacket pocket, he found a small multi-tool. The plier tip held several hairs and old darkened blood. The separate details began forming a clear sequence. Caleb may have met the Bigfoot near the cliff edge, seen the metal fragment in its shoulder, and chosen to help instead of run. He used the pliers to pull the fragment loose, making the wound bleed. At that moment, the rock layer above began to shift. The creature sensed danger before the human did, and tried to push Caleb away from the ledge. Caleb misunderstood in panic, stepped back onto cracked soil, and slid down. The Bigfoot grabbed the backpack strap, but the fabric tore before it could pull him back. After the fall, the creature brought the backpack, opened the first aid kit, and tried to repeat what it had seen humans do. When every effort failed, it stayed, drove scavengers away, and kept the body intact. Brian looked toward the adult Bigfoot. The creature touched its wounded shoulder, then looked down at Caleb. Brian placed a hand on his own shoulder, repeating the gesture to show he understood. The Bigfoot dipped its head very slightly, a small movement that made Marissa stop taking pictures for several seconds. Evan stood a few steps away, his face tight with regret. He admitted that his gunshot had nearly killed the creature that tried to save Caleb and had protected them from the bear. Brian did not add blame. He only told Evan he needed to remember this moment for the rest of his life. The silence around the chute carried real grief. When Marissa opened the body bag, the smallest individual stepped forward, took Caleb's cold hand, and held it as if not yet ready for the man to leave the forest. The small individual continued holding Caleb's hand, wrapping its fingers gently around the dead man's wrist in a way that made everyone stop. Brian signaled for Marissa not to close the bag yet, while Evan moved back to reduce the sense of threat. The adult Bigfoot approached, placed a hand on the small individual's shoulder, and released a low, slow sound that felt more like a reminder than a command. The small one looked up, then lowered its head beside Caleb. From the leaves near the chute, it picked up a smooth white stone, placed it in the man's palm, and closed his cold fingers around it. The mid-sized individual came forward, chose a cedar branch, and laid it neatly across Caleb's chest. The adult Bigfoot stood opposite the body and lowered its head very slowly. Brian felt it was a farewell ritual repeated through their own form of understanding. He bowed his head too. Marissa and Evan followed, letting the silence belong to Caleb and the beings that had stayed beside him for 2 days. When the adult touched the small one's arm, it released the dead man's hand and stepped back. Marissa placed Caleb inside the body bag, leaving the stone and cedar branch inside instead of moving them to evidence. She understood those items were not traces to seize, they were the final goodbye. Brian and Evan secured the bag to the drag litter. The path out of the chute was blocked by a large fallen trunk, and as they considered going around, the adult Bigfoot stepped forward, slid both arms beneath the wood, and lifted it aside with a strength that left Evan silent. The creature did not walk beside the group, but moved parallel between the trees, stopping now and then to watch. At the boundary where it had first blocked them, the Bigfoot stopped completely. Brian took out Caleb's family photo and raised it so the creature could see it one last time. The Bigfoot's eyes paused on the little girl's face before moving to the body bag on the litter. It placed one hand on its chest. Brian answered with the same gesture. The 3 creatures slowly withdrew into the forest and disappeared into thinning fog. As birdsong returned with dawn light, Brian's radio caught signal from the office. Daniel's voice came through, saying a federal agency had learned about unidentified animal activity and was waiting for them to return so all evidence could be handed over. When the rescue helicopter landed near Baker Lake, Caleb's body was transferred to the local forensic team, while Brian, Marissa, and Evan were ordered back to the office. They had not even changed out of their wet clothes when Daniel led them into the conference room. 3 people in plain clothes were already waiting. The man in front introduced himself as Warren Pike, representing an interagency unit responsible for dangerous animals and resource security. The way he placed his file on the table made Brian understand this meeting was not advisory. Pike asked about footprint size, number of individuals, direction of travel, and their reaction to weapons. He almost ignored Caleb's cause of death, only confirming that the body showed no sign of animal attack. Brian realized these people cared about photos, GPS data, and thermal camera footage. Pike demanded all memory cards, body camera footage, radio recordings, and positioning devices. Daniel said this was mandatory procedure, but Brian reminded him all data was still part of a Skagit County death investigation. Pike produced a takeover document with many lines blacked out and said his unit's authority went beyond the local level. During the argument, Marissa secretly placed a backup memory card in Brian's palm under the table. She had copied the key images before leaving the forest. Evan sat silent, hands locked together, still buried in guilt after the gunshot. Pike pushed 3 non-disclosure agreements toward them and used the term unclassified primate animal in a practiced voice, as if he had said it many times before. Brian asked how many similar cases Pike's unit had handled. Pike did not answer. He only said creatures like these could become dangerous if the public learned their location. Brian asked why they had arrived so quickly. Pike admitted that any report containing certain keywords had long been forwarded into a federal system. Brian handed over copies, with frames removed that might reveal the shelter location, while slightly adjusting coordinates on the map. Pike reviewed each file, then looked up at Brian with cold, clear eyes. Before leaving the room, he leaned close and said they had been tracking this group longer than Brian realized, and next time, Brian should not stand between them and their target. 3 days after returning from the North Cascades, Brian completed the investigation report in his familiar office, preserving each detail in precise language. He listed Caleb's cause of death as trauma from falling off a rock face after a slide, and described the large unidentified footprints around the scene and their role in keeping the body from scavengers. Brian chose each sentence carefully, avoiding mention of the shelter location, the number of creatures, and any gesture that might allow someone to trace them. By afternoon, the report came back with multiple sections revised. The footprint section had vanished completely, and the final wording only said there was no evidence of animal involvement in the death. Brian carried the file to Daniel's office and asked who had altered a document under county authority. Daniel avoided looking directly at him, explaining the order had come from the federal level and advising him to let the matter close. That answer told Brian Pike's power had gone deeper than one interrogation. Marissa also discovered that all photos on the server had been copied, and some originals were locked by access permissions the local office did not control. Evan was absent for 2 days and returned looking exhausted. He admitted Pike had interviewed him privately and that he had told them what he saw because he believed authorities needed to prepare for a danger. Brian asked whether Evan gave them real coordinates or body camera data. Evan said he did not remember how much detail he mentioned, but the hesitation in his voice made the room heavy. Marissa reported that a dangerous animal survey had been scheduled around Baker Lake. Brian immediately called Ranger Tom Alvarez, who had worked with him on many searches. Tom confirmed that unmarked vehicles, drones, metal crates, and strange equipment had been brought onto the forest road. A few minutes later, Tom sent a photo of a warning label on a box of tranquilizers meant for animals weighing over 1,000 pounds. Brian looked at the photo and understood they were not preparing to observe. They were preparing to capture 2 weeks. After recovering Caleb's body, Brian returned to the eastern side of Baker Lake with Marissa and Ranger Tom Alvarez, under the cover of checking slide hazards. The forest road was still damp and cold, but the once empty area now showed signs of a prepared operation. On the first fir trunk, Tom found a camouflaged camera mounted almost 10 feet high, aimed straight at an animal trail rather than a human route. A few hundred yards away, Marissa saw infrared sensor wire stretched across the creek bank, hidden under pine needles, and connected to a transmitter under a rock. Brian moved along the slope and found an audio recorder, cold-resistant battery packs, and bait bags filled with meat, fruit, and a sharp-smelling substance. Tom explained that this was not normal survey equipment, because the signal was being sent in real time through satellite. In a low patch of ground, Marissa brushed away wet leaves and uncovered a large cable snare wide enough to lock around the leg of a creature weighing hundreds of kilograms. Beside it were 2 tranquilizer darts and drag marks from wheels leading toward a metal transport crate. Brian stood in silence before the equipment, understanding Pike had never intended to simply observe. He wanted to take a living individual out of the forest. The 3 searched near the rock chute, but found only footprints softened by rain. Brian began hoping the Bigfoot family had left the area until Tom found a piece of bandage caught on a low branch. Dark blood and several gray-brown hairs showed the injured creature had passed through after their encounter. From far away, a single knock sounded. Brian picked up a short branch and knocked back in the familiar rhythm, but the forest did not answer. Tom looked up at the camera and reminded him that the act may have just been transmitted live to a control center. Brian removed the memory card from the nearest device, then realized the data had already left it. They decided to shift several cameras, disable a few snare wires, and create false tracks toward the west. Marissa scattered bare hair around the sample points, while Tom warned that all 3 of them could lose their jobs if caught. Just as they prepared to withdraw, a small rotor noise appeared above the canopy. A drone lowered, rotated its lens, and held Brian in the center of the frame. The drone followed until Brian, Marissa, and Tom returned to the forest road. Near the final bend, 2 SUVs blocked the exit, and Warren Pike stood beside one vehicle with 4 agents. He asked why. A deputy sheriff, a forensic investigator, and a ranger were inside a controlled area. Brian answered that they were evaluating slide hazards after the rain, then pointed out that the devices hidden under leaves could injure hikers. Pike said several cameras had been turned and multiple snares disabled. Brian calmly suggested that bears, branches, or sliding soil could have caused that. Pike opened a tablet and showed them drone footage clearly recording Brian beside a camera. Marissa spoke up, explaining that the device had no permit markings, so they had to inspect it. Pike warned that interference with a federal operation could lead to prosecution. Brian asked directly which animal the operation was targeting. Pike went silent, then said the creatures in the forest were not recognized by law, and therefore had no protected status and no rights to territory. Brian answered that lacking a scientific name did not turn a being with memory, family, and the ability to choose into property. Pike looked at him, then explained that capturing one living individual could change biology, medicine, and human understanding. To him, the scientific value was great enough to justify intervention. Brian understood he was standing before a man who saw Bigfoot intelligence as a reason for possession, not respect. Pike asked for the true location of the shelter. Brian pointed west and said tracks showed the creatures had moved down into another valley long ago. Pike looked at the false trail and seemed to accept part of the story. Before allowing them to leave, he said Evan had provided enough data to narrow the range. When Brian returned to the office, Daniel told him Evan was missing, and his vehicle had been found on the road, leading directly into Bigfoot territory. Daniel said Evan had been out of contact for more than 10 hours, and his phone last pinged near the federal trap area. The news made Brian immediately forget every bit of anger he still felt. Warren Pike appeared at the office only minutes later with 2 agents, and a conclusion already prepared. Evan may have been attacked or taken by the unclassified primate. Brian objected because the abandoned vehicle and phone signal did not prove anything. Pike used the disappearance to demand an armed team, search dogs, and thermal gear deployed that night. While Daniel argued about jurisdiction, Marissa searched Evan's desks and found a folded map hidden beneath the drawer. It had the true coordinates of the rock chute, approach routes, and notes showing Pike had promised Evan a position in the federal unit if he led them to the correct area. Brian felt betrayed, but that feeling quickly gave way to worry when he saw the final line Evan had written. "If they catch the little one, they will never stop." Brian and Marissa left the office before Pike's team finished preparing. They followed Evan's boot prints from his vehicle into the forest. At first, his tracks traveled with 2 other sets of boots, then split from them near a cable snare. The leaves around the snare were torn up, and the cable held dark blood and gray-brown fur. Brian realized a Bigfoot had been caught. Cut marks on the cable showed Evan had freed it. A few yards away, they found an empty tranquilizer dart shell and a long slide mark down the slope. There was almost no human blood, but Evan's boot prints became crooked, mixed with huge footprints. He had walked on his own for a short distance, then his tracks vanished, as if a creature had lifted him. Brian understood Evan may have been hit by a dart during the chaos, and Bigfoot had carried him away before Pike's team returned. They continued down into the ravine and heard a weak groan over the water. Beneath the roots of a fallen tree, they found only Evan's backpack, wet jacket, and still lit flashlight. When Brian called his name, 3 short knocks came from the valley, in the exact rescue rhythm he had used in missing person searches. The sound made Brian stop because it did not feel like a threat. It felt like a guide meant specifically for him in the dark. Brian listened to the 3 knocks echoing through the valley, then led Marissa along the creek toward the sound. The path narrowed between moss-covered rocks, forcing them to crouch under interwoven branches. When they reached a deep pocket of forest, the adult Bigfoot stepped from the darkness. The bandage on its shoulder was stained with blood and mud, but the eyes it gave Brian no longer held the same defense as their first meeting. The creature turned and walked slowly forward, stopping to make sure the 2 humans followed. Brian understood this was guidance. They went on until they saw a rock hollow covered with fir branches, dry to leaves, and small trunks stacked deliberately at the end of a leaf-covered path. Evan lay inside, unconscious but breathing. His clothes were soaked, his lips pale, and a tranquilizer dart was still embedded in his thigh. Marissa knelt and checked pulse, pupils, and breathing, then said Evan was reacting to both the drug and hypothermia. Under his back was a thick layer of moss, and dry leaves had been packed around his body to help hold heat. The mid-sized creature sat near the entrance, while the smallest held Evan's forensic badge. Brian removed the dart, bandaged the wound, and helped Marissa wrap a thermal blanket around him. After emergency medication, Evan opened his eyes. His voice broke as he admitted Pike had promised him a place in the federal unit if he gave them the route in. When he saw the cable tightening around Bigfoot's leg, Evan realized he had led hunters to a family. He cut the trap, but a federal agent fired a dart by mistake during the chaos. The Bigfoot carried him away before Pike's team returned. Brian looked around the hollow and found several small sleeping places, bundles of gathered roots, and tracks from an elderly individual moving with difficulty. This place did not belong only to the 3 creatures they had seen. It was shelter for an entire community, with young and vulnerable members. Evan tried to say the hunting team was entering from the east with dogs and thermal cameras. Brian turned to Marissa and told her to get Evan down the safe route. He would stay and lead the Bigfoot family away from the trap zone. At that moment, barking sounded closer, and drone lights began sweeping through the canopy above. The barking grew closer, mixing with drone rotors, cutting the forest with cold beams. Brian knew that if the whole Bigfoot community moved together, thermal cameras would capture the heat signatures and lead Pike's team straight to the shelter. He took a rescue flare, adjusted the direction, and threw it down the south slope. Red light burst through wet brush, creating a heat point large enough to pull the drone away from the hollow. Marissa helped Evan down toward the lower route, while Brian turned back and signaled the adult Bigfoot to move west. The creature looked at him, then turned toward the small individual, pressed beside an older shape emerging from the shelter. The elder moved slowly, one leg dragging slightly, making Brian realize the whole community could not run at search team speed. He studied the land and remembered a narrow rock trench behind the fur line, where two vertical walls might shield body heat from a high scanning angle. It was the only route, even though the ground around it had softened after days of rain. Brian knocked 3 times on a tree trunk, pointed west, and stepped first to demonstrate. The adult Bigfoot hesitated, then bent down, lifted the elder onto its back, and urged the rest of the group to follow. The dogs changed direction, proving the hunters had discovered the new movement line. Flashlights began pushing through trees from the east, while voices called to one another from the south, showing 2 teams were closing the circle. Brian led the entire community into the rock trench, constantly choosing sections with high walls to avoid the drone. When the radio on his shoulder came alive with Pike, ordering him to stop, Brian turned it off, removed the badge from his shirt, and put it in his pocket. He knew this choice could end his career, but turning away now would let the beings who saved Caleb and Evan be captured. They had just reached the mouth of the trench when a sound blast erupted ahead. The small individual panicked, separated from the group, and ran straight toward the trap field. The small one disappeared between the trees. The adult Bigfoot lowered the elder to the ground and turned to chase after it. Brian understood the creature would become the largest target if it charged directly into the area where the hunting team waited. He raised a hand to stop it, pointed to his own chest, then toward the path the young one had taken, trying to show that he would go instead. The Bigfoot stared at Brian through one tense beat, then remained beside the trench. Brian ran down the slope, following broken branches and small footprints pressed deep into mud. A steel cable snapped ahead. The small one had caught a foot in a snare hidden under leaves, and the more it struggled, the deeper the cable cut into its ankle. Brian lowered himself and spoke in the slow, even voice he had used when he first stood before the family. The creature recognized him, but panic still made both arms whip at the ground. Brian took out his knife, crawled close, and slid the blade under the cable. Each time the young one jerked its leg, his hand stopped to avoid tearing the wound wider. In the drone light, Brian saw blood soaking through fur and knew they were almost out of time. At that moment, a federal agent stepped from behind a tree, tranquilizer gun already shouldered. The man ordered Brian to move away from the target. Brian stood, blocking the entire space before the young one, and said a dose meant for an adult could kill a creature that small. Warren Pike appeared behind him and coldly ordered Brian to step back and let the specialist team handle it. Brian kept cutting the cable, while Pike warned that he was obstructing a federal operation. When the loop released, the small creature pulled its leg back and staggered behind Brian. Pike ordered the dart fired. From the forest edge, the adult Bigfoot charged in, but instead of attacking the armed men, it wrapped one arm around Brian and the young one, pulling both out of the firing line. The dart struck the tree behind them. The remaining agents immediately shifted to live weapons. Brian stood, lifted his badge against his chest, and warned that any shot now could kill a law officer. That moment of hesitation was enough for the Bigfoot to carry the young one back toward the rock trench. Pike lowered the dart rifle, then ordered the northern team to lock down the trench entrance, turning the community's last exit into a closed trap. Pike stood at the mouth of the rock trench, his voice calm, as if everything had already been decided. This was a chance to confirm a species science had not yet recognized, and insisted his team only needed to capture one living individual. When Pike's eyes stopped on the young one, hiding behind the adult Bigfoot, Brian understood that the easiest target to control was also the weakest member of the family. He stepped forward, keeping enough distance that the armed agents would not have an excuse to react, and asked Pike whether history needed a discovery built by splitting a family apart. Pike answered that history remembered the people who brought back proof. Brian looked at the adult, standing before the young and the elder, both arms spread wide in protection. Its strength would terrify anyone, but from their first meeting, it had always chosen warning, rescue, and retreat before conflict moved beyond control. Brian pointed that out, saying restraint was clear evidence of intelligence. Pike saw that same intelligence as a reason the creature was more valuable to study. Brian realized moral argument would not change the man in front of him. He shifted his eyes toward the rock slope above, where pebbles were falling after the sound blast. Long rain had softened the soil, and cracks ran through the wall just like the place that had collapsed beneath Caleb. Brian warned that more noise or heavy movement could pull the whole mountainside down. Pike claimed he was stalling and ordered the northern team forward. Brian struck 3 hard knocks against a tree. The adult Bigfoot turned its head, understood the warning signal, and pushed the others back toward a narrow gap behind the wall. Pike saw the movement and realized there was a secondary escape path. He ordered pursuit. Brian drew a flare and fired it into the wet leaves along the slope, creating thick smoke through the trench. While the hunting team lost visibility, he pulled an old anchor rope tangled beneath a tree root, sending logs rolling down to block the route. They injured no one, but split Pike's team into 2 groups. The Bigfoot began leading the family toward the cave opening. Brian was backing after them when the ground under his feet trembled. A section of cliff above broke loose and collapsed between him and the exit. The section of rock tore from the mountainside with a long roar, pulling wet soil and young trees down into the trench. Brian turned and ran for the cave mouth, but the rock under his foot slid out from place, dragging him to the edge of a deep gap. His hands caught an exposed root, and his full weight pulled hard through his shoulders, sending pain down both arms. Above him, Pike and the hunting team were blocked by falling stone. The adult Bigfoot had already brought the young one close to the cave entrance. But when it heard Brian call, it stopped, passed the young one to the mid-sized individual, and came back. The creature charged through dust, lowering its body to avoid rolling stones, and crawled to the gap. The moment made Brian remember the giant handprints at the cliff where Caleb had fallen. Last time, the creature had tried to hold a man and failed. This time, its huge hand closed around Brian's wrist and pulled him up with decisive strength just before the root ripped free. Brian had barely rolled to safety when a large rock came down toward Pike. The Bigfoot saw it first, reached out, shoved the man aside, and took a long gash across its arm. Pike lay frozen in the mud, staring at the being he wanted to capture standing over his body. The Bigfoot did not turn to attack the hunting team. It only backed toward the cave entrance, keeping its body between the guns and the family waiting behind it. Brian stood and ordered everyone to lower their weapons. Several agents obeyed after seeing 2 lives saved. Pike still held his tranquilizer gun, but his hand had lost its certainty. Brian said that if Pike pulled the trigger, his entire team would have to testify that he shot the creature that had just saved his life. From below, Marissa and Tom appeared, Marissa's camera still recording everything. Pike understood the footage was enough to break any report that might be rewritten later. He lowered the muzzle. For several seconds, the forest held only the sound of falling pebbles and the rough breathing of people who had just survived. The adult Bigfoot backed a few more steps, placed a hand on its chest, and turned toward Brian. Brian answered with the familiar gesture. The community disappeared one by one through the western cave gap. When the federal team reached it, they found only a network of stone passages stretching deep beneath the mountain. And every footprint had been erased by newly running water. After rescue crews brought Brian, Evan, and the injured out of the slide area, the incident was pushed into a closed investigation. Brian was taken to the hospital, while Evan stayed under observation for the effects of the tranquilizer. When Evan became clearer, he confirmed that Bigfoot had pulled him from the trap zone and kept him alive through the cold night. Marissa copied the footage of the creature saving Brian and Pike onto several devices before the federal agency could seize it. Pike appeared at the hospital with a file and demanded that everyone surrender recordings, images, and statements for reasons of national security. Brian refused to hand over the originals, saying the data involved an operation that may have violated local authority. Pike warned that he could be prosecuted for obstruction and damage to federal property. Brian understood the threat had limits because any public trial would force Pike to admit the target of the operation. After negotiation, an unspoken agreement formed. Brian, Marissa, and Evan would remain silent. Pike would not bring charges. The area around the rock trench would be closed because of slide risk. The official report said only that Evan was injured while inspecting illegal animal traps. Daniel met privately with Brian and asked what had really happened in the forest. Brian answered that some truths had to be protected before they could be revealed. Evan returned the map, data, and an apology, and gave up the idea of joining the federal unit. Marissa kept a copy of the video in a safe. Pike left, but before stepping into his vehicle, he reminded them that future operations would have better technology. A few weeks later, Brian returned to the road near Baker Lake to inspect the new warning signs. On the hood of his vehicle lay a smooth white stone, identical to the one the Bigfoot family had placed in Caleb's hand. Brian held the stone and understood the forest still remembered who had kept his word through the years that followed. In the years afterward, Brian continued wearing the Skagit County uniform and doing his job as if the 2018 trip had never happened. But every missing person case in the Cascades made him read the scene differently. When an 8-year-old boy got lost near Sauk Mountain, the search team found him asleep beneath a shelter of fir branches, beside a circle of stones and large footprints that ended before rescuers arrived. The boy said he had heard knocks leading him away from the roar of a wild animal. Brian recorded the statement but adjusted the coordinates enough that the curious could not trace the place. An old hunter later said he had survived a snowstorm thanks to steady sounds coming from a mountainside. A ranger from a Coast Salish community told Brian that the old people did not call them monsters. They saw them as people living deep in the mountains, appearing only when boundaries were crossed or someone needed to be guided. Those stories made Brian revisit dozens of old reports. Most accounts of attacks lacked blood, bodies, or signs of struggle, while many survivors remembered branches arranged into shelter, food placed near hiding spots, or knocks guiding them back to a trail. Brian began using his professional influence to close certain routes during bear breeding seasons. Citing slide hazards or wildfire danger, though his real purpose was to keep distance between humans and the families that had never asked to be discovered. Sometimes during patrols, he heard 3 knocks echo across the valley. Once, on a fog-covered slope, Brian saw the adult creature standing beside the small individual from years earlier, now almost as tall as its shoulder. He stopped the vehicle, placed a hand on his chest, and drove away. Brian understood that trust between 2 species could exist only if both knew their limits. At the end of 2023, a file appeared on his desk titled Cascade Deep Survey, announcing a large-scale search operation scheduled to begin the following summer. At the beginning of 2024, with his retirement date already marked on the calendar, Brian received the Cascade Deep Survey file and read it alone in his small kitchen. The new plan used thermal drones, acoustic sensors, movement recognition software, and survey teams equipped to operate for weeks in the mountains. The routes marked on the map overlapped with the old movement corridors of the Bigfoot family. Warren Pike was no longer directly in command, but the program he had started had become a larger operation, hidden beneath the language of science and interagency funding. Brian called Marissa and Evan. Marissa confirmed the footage was still locked in a safe. Evan said he was willing to testify if continued silence placed the creatures in danger. All 3 understood that releasing the full images would create a craze more dangerous than the federal operation. Hunters, media, and curious people would flood the Cascades with cameras, guns, and the greed of becoming the first person to own proof. So Brian decided to tell the story while hiding the true coordinates, changing some routes, and removing any detail that could lead to the shelters. He did not want to prove Bigfoot existed. What he wanted people to understand was that the creature standing before Caleb's body was not a monster guarding a corpse. It was protecting the dead, answering Caleb's kindness, and defending its family from intruders. What Brian remembered most was never the height, the roar, or the strength powerful enough to shake a tree. He remembered its choices. The creature warned instead of killing. It saved Evan after Evan betrayed them. It came back to pull Brian from the gap. It even saved Pike, the man who brought traps into the forest to hunt it. On the final night before retirement, Brian placed the white stone on his table and looked at it under the kitchen light, understanding he had kept his word for 6 years. The next morning, he drove to a lookout outside the restricted zone. Fog covered the slopes, and the fir forest stretched like a dark wall. From very far away, 3 slow knocks sounded. Brian placed his hand on his chest, answered once with a piece of wood, and returned to his vehicle. He did not step into the forest. He had understood that too late. Some secrets are best protected by distance, and some creatures only continue trusting humans when humans know when to leave.